Make sure we've got plenty of batches.
That's it.
Hello? Yeah.
Great. Well done, Lloyd. What was the problem? I don't know. It's worked. So can I unplug this now?
All right, yeah, it's good to see the microphone.
Oh, yeah, that's good. Yeah, that's good. We
Cheers.
don't.
Lloyd, get downstairs.
you ready to try nursing again?
Yeah. Hi, Emma. Hey, why do you think she won't take my breast?
It's all right, honey. Takes some babies a while to get it, but don't worry, it'll happen.
Yowza.
Hey!
Hi.
That to the green side, it'll then pick up.
Hello? Okay, I'm turning on my mic. You can hear me. I'm a bit echoey.
Hey, are you ready to try nursing again?
Hi, Emma. Hey, why do you think she won't take my
Is that me
breath?
because I'm here with
It's
my
all
mic?
right, honey. Takes some babies a while to get it, but don't worry, it'll happen.
Oh, you know what? I can turn this
Open
off.
up and put it in your mouth.
Dear Lord.
I'm sorry, honey. What were you saying?
Yeah, look, I think that...
Oh, because look, she's pulling away again. Do you think my nipples are too...
Is that working? Okay. Right, let's see what happens. Okay, so this is me. I'm the attractive person in the middle. Early 70s, North Wales. My dad's a pig farmer. You wouldn't know it from the amount of white he's wearing. I doubt he ever looked that clean again. And I show you this photograph because this is the beginning of my world of breasts. My mum had me in her early 20s. She did not breastfeed me for a minute. It did not occur to her to breastfeed. She did not even remember making the decision not to breastfeed because she was around at a time when initiation was less than 10% in England and Wales. The lowest breastfeeding rates that we've ever had in human history were in parts of Western Europe and America in this kind of period, the 70s and going into the 80s. So we've got this generation of grannies who have missed out completely, who, for most of them, not all of them, and probably not necessarily the ones that are associated with people in this room, for most of them, breastfeeding is not their normal. And we are asking them to then be our supporters and be the mother-in-laws and the mothers of the new generation who are breastfeeding. That is a massive ask. It is an enormous ask when every time someone breastfeeds in front of you, it is reinforcing the fact that that is not a decision that you made. You do not have faith in breastfeeding. You do not have faith in somebody who responsibly feeds in particular. And this generation struggled largely because of the ignorance of the medical profession. The belief that breastfeeding should happen every 3 or 4 hours, that newborns shouldn't have to breastfeed overnight, that babies shouldn't be held unnecessarily, all that stuff that we could do a whole presentation on resulted in this lost generation of grannies. And we know it takes a village to raise a breastfeeding parent, not even a baby, a breastfeeding parent. But in many areas, we don't have that village. And as breastfeeding peer supporters and midwives, we're trying to be that village. We're trying to substitute for that lost generation. But it's a heck of a lot to ask even us to do, especially when there are cuts to services and things are going on that are making our lives even harder. So sometimes we do have to think outside the box. And that means things like the breastfeeding voucher scheme in Sheffield, that for many of us felt very odd when it was first being talked about. But when you read the research and you see the impact it's had, you realise that sometimes we do have to think outside the box. Here's me. A few years later, I'm the screaming person in the middle, bright red in the face. I'm very excited about the fact the Queen's been on the throne for 25 years. I don't know why. And when I look at this photograph, I associate this with, again, early memories around breasts. So I remember being measured for that blue sash by the 70s-looking lady up there. I remember her pulling me aside in the classroom. By the way, this is the whole school on this float. Pulling me aside and saying, right, come on, let's measure you for your sash. And at 5, I had these weird feelings around my chest being secret and private. I sort of knew I shouldn't be showing it to people. Where did those messages come from? I felt horribly uncomfortable. I also didn't feel I had the right to say no to her. So I did it even though I didn't want to do it. Wow, that's a lot of powerful messaging that's come from somewhere in a very, very short period of time. Fast forward a few more years, and this is my attractive haircut when I was about 11, 12. You can see we've got breast development happening there. It's got even more along that line. But of course, my breasts had actually started to develop when I was 4 weeks old in utero, before I was even a fetus, when I was still just an embryo. That's when the milk line starts to develop. That's when the mammary ridge starts to develop. Very few people know that we develop breasts before we develop feet, before we develop eyes. The reason that men have nipples is because our species prioritizes lactation to such a degree, we're going to start everybody with the milk line just in case. And when you start using language like that, we are sending messages that say breastfeeding matters to us as a species. It's so important that our evolution has prioritized it to that degree. And at school, you won't hear those things being mentioned. You will instead draw this diagram 1,000 times. When you're getting ready for your biology GCSE, I remember drawing that literally with my eyes closed. I must have seen that picture 1,000 times. My daughter, who's just started secondary school, had her sex education at the end of year 6. That was the diagram that was on her fact sheet at the end of her year 6 sex education. Nothing about breasts, nothing about breast development. By the way, that's not even what that looks like, because in real life, a uterus does that, and fallopian tubes tip back, and we're looking more like the fairy at the front of a Rolls Royce. But that's the picture that we associate with body development and menstruation. How often do people tell you that menstruation is about breast development? How often do people tell you that the menstrual cycle is about breast development? Very, very rarely. The menstrual cycle is about bleeding, isn't it? It's about thickening of the uterine wall. It's about loss of blood. It's about, bleeding for X number of days. But we need to talk to young people about the fact the menstrual cycle is about breasts as well. And we'll talk about that a bit more in a minute. Okay, so what's that coloured circle called around the nipple? What do we call it? So I can hear most of you saying something. Lots of people, adult women, not going to be the people in this room, lots of adult women don't have a word for it. So they might say coloured circle, that thing around the end of my nipple. I know a lactation consultant who doesn't use the term medical word anymore because it alienates too many women who come like, what did you say, huh? When they talk about their own bodies, that's not a word that they're using. In British English, there are 3 accepted pronunciations for that word. So we've got the areola, which I think a lot of us say. We've got the areola, and we've got the areola. All those 3 pronunciations are considered valid. So that's a bit of a clue that we're not using that word very much. Even in British English, we haven't agreed how to pronounce it. And if we can't describe our own bodies, we're going to be suffering. As young people, when our areolas are developing, if we can't say, I'm a bit worried about the fact that my areola looks like this, we're already at a disadvantage. If, as a breastfeeding parent, you're on the helpline and you want to talk about where there's a crack, or you want to talk about where there's some pain, if you have to pause for a moment to think about what word you're going to use, you're going to feel even more vulnerable at a time when you're already feeling vulnerable. If you have to stumble over trying to say the word, immediately you're going to feel more vulnerable. So you may just not say it. You may just talk about nipples. And the person on the helpline is going to give you incorrect information. What we also find is that the Montgomery's glands, or the Montgomery's tubercles, or the areola glands, the little bumps that most people will develop around their areola, is also a huge area of ignorance. Lots of people think if the bumps are visible, that means you're pregnant. So you get lots of panicking young women who think that if they're visible, that must be a sign of pregnancy. It's not always. It can be associated with pregnancy, but not always. When I was researching the breast book, I spoke to lots of young people, lots of young women, and a conversation that kept happening was somebody who thought that the Montgomery's glands was acne, was an abnormality. And I spoke to one girl who picked away at her Montgomery's glands, had lots of scars and damage. We also find that breastfeeding mums who aren't expecting them to perhaps become more prominent, because these are sebaceous glands that are likely to become more prominent in breastfeeding, they think they've got some kind of blister, they do a bit of Googling, they think they might have a bleb. I've spoken to one mother who uses a needle on her Montgomery's glands thinking that's what she's meant to do. Really basic things happening because we're not having simple conversations about normal anatomy. No one's telling them, actually, the Montgomery's glands have a wonderful purpose. They produce antiseptics and lubricants. They do great things. It's fine if they're prominent and they come and go during a menstrual cycle. This is not a conversation that's happening very often. When you go online and you look for diagrams on breast structure, you can waste many hours because it really tells you what a mess we are in when it comes to knowledge around breastfeeding. I'm not saying this is the best one by a long way. There's many, many different ones there, but this one covers quite a lot. So we've obviously got the nipple openings, the ducts ending on the nipple. We've got the Cooper's ligaments and the fibrous tissue that support the structure of the breast. We've got a pretty good proportion of fat cells to glandular cells. We've got the lobules and the lobes, or the alveoli, the micro stuff inside that's actually producing the milk and taking the constituents of milk from the bloodstream. And we've got the lymph nodes, which are an important part of the structure of the breast and have an important role to play in how breast tissue goes. So much ignorance around this. When you go online, you will see at least half of the diagrams still talk about sinuses, lactiferous sinuses behind the areola, that bulging area, all over the place, including in my book, because the illustrators that created the breast illustration in my book put a little bulge there. And that little bulge was absolutely assumed to be there right up until the late 90s, and even today you'll see people talking about it. And for those of you who don't know, it's because Mr. Cooper, who was the chap who was interested in breasts, got some wax, injected wax into cadavers and deceased women to study breast structure. And when you inject wax into very small flexible tubes, they're quite often going to bulge. So those bulges behind the areola were just a response to the wax being injected. But people thought that, for breastfeeding, probably the baby's squeezing on those, aren't they? The baby's squeezing on the reservoir of milk. That's how the milk's coming out of the breast. No, 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 no. Now we know from ultrasound and computerized technology that actually a lot of milk's coming out of the breast because of the subatmospheric pressure that the baby's creating by dropping their tongue. They're creating a vacuum. Then the milk comes out of the breast to equalize the pressure in the baby's mouth. So it's not about stripping the breast with the tongue. It's not even really about compressing the breast with the tongue to a large extent. It's about that creation of that vacuum that draws the milk out of the breast. And if you want to read more about that, David Elad in Israel is a good bit of research that kind of summarizes those findings. So if we don't understand how milk is removed, because we don't understand how breast structure works, we're going to give all sorts of incorrect messages about tongue function, we're going to give all sorts of incorrect messages about hand expression, we're going to tell people the wrong stuff. Here's an example of a couple of diagrams that I found online recently. This one is for adults. This is a Canadian Montreal health organisation. How's that for giving up? Yeah, you know, glands and milk ducts. In the middle, there's some stuff that's to do with milk. That'll do. And this one, okay, so this was for an audience who are considering breast enlargement, but it's very unlikely that someone with that much glandular tissue is going to have that much fat in relation to that much glandular tissue. Absolute nonsense. And that is just all over the place. In medical websites, medical books, bizarre things are happening. We would never get away with having such a gap about knowledge in any other area of our body. It's absolutely mad. So one thing I talk about is the idea that all this information, you know, it's called an areola, and that's how the baby takes milk out, and that's how breastfeeding works. Doing all that in between, oh, I'm pregnant, and here's the baby, if we're trying to do that as a culture, we are setting ourselves up to fail. How on earth can all that information about how breastfeeding works and how milk production works happen in those few months when you're already completely overwhelmed? It's like teaching driving when someone is literally about to merge onto the motorway. These are conversations that should be happening from the very first moment that breasts start to develop, and even before that. So let's just have a look at this video. Let's imagine that you are 14, 15, no one's ever talked to you about breasts, no one's ever talked to you about breastfeeding, it's not in the curriculum at school, your parents haven't talked to you about it. Instead, this is where you're going to get your information from. And Friends is very popular at the moment.
Are you ready to try nursing again?
Yeah. Hi, Emma. Hey, why do you think she won't take my breast?
It's all right, honey. Takes some babies a while to get it, but don't worry, it'll happen.
Yowza.
Sweetie, you can do it. Just open up and put it in your mouth.
Dear Lord.
I'm sorry, honey. What were you saying?
Yeah, look, I think that...
Oh, because look, she's pulling away again. Do you think my nipples are too big for her mouth? She looks scared. Doesn't she look scared?
You know, I don't really know her.
Why don't we try massaging the breast to stimulate the flow?
Okay.
Are you kidding me?
It's so frustrating. Why doesn't she want my breast?
I don't know. Maybe she's crazy.
I'm so sorry. Okay, sorry about that, people downstairs. I was just echoing. Okay, so self-examination. Those are the other two references to breasts. And this is a theme that comes up a lot when you talk to young people. As a culture, we are talking about cancer and self-examination before we're talking about normal, healthy breasts and what normal breasts look like. We are not going to build a society of people who feel comfortable doing self-examination if we do not start with what normal, healthy breasts look like. And instead, we've got young people who develop normally. A lot of the markers for adolescent breast development and pre-adolescent breast development are actually the same markers as you might see for breast cancer on a breast cancer charity website. So an inverted nipple, a temporarily inverted nipple, tenderness, a breast bud, a lump, asymmetry, all these things are normal parts of breast development. If you're a young person and you Google, my nipple's just gone inverted temporarily, you will get to breast cancer information because there's nothing there about what normal breasts look like. So we've got to be really careful about emphasizing self-examination if there is not alongside it a healthy conversation about what normal breasts are like. And I actually got some criticism when I wrote the breast book for not talking about self-examination in more detail for the 9 to 14-year-olds. I purposely did that because they need to know first, they deserve to know first what a healthy breast looks like. I did make some references to it. I told them to go and find more information later on when they're older. But that is not the place, if the first time someone meets breasts, to have cancer at the very front of the conversation. In this guidance, there is a subheading on menstruation. So menstruation gets its whole subheading, and in that section, it does not refer to breast development again. So there's just a huge gap. So the ABM, a quick plug for the ABM materials, if you haven't already come across them, we tried to fill this gap a little bit. We created this scheme of work that can be used in schools, and there's some slides that go along with it as well. If you want to find them, go to the ABM website, look in the About Us section. It says Resources for Schools, and then you have, there's some slides that need to be downloaded to a PowerPoint-friendly device, so you may not get that on your phone, but you can get the scheme of work on your phone. And I used to be a Key Stage 2 teacher, so lots of the lessons are around Key Stage 2. But there's also some stuff in the early years and some stuff for Key Stage 3 as well. We know that for many teachers, breastfeeding is going to be scary because most people in the UK do not reach their breastfeeding goals. So we're either going to be talking about an individual teacher who hasn't or their partner who didn't. So we need to be upfront about that. We need to say that we understand this is going to be difficult for teachers. And we encourage them to bring peer supporters into the classroom and to bring mothers into the classroom to help them feel more empowered to have these conversations. And hopefully they will then go on to talk about breasts and breastfeeding in a healthy way outside these lessons. One of the lessons just talks about how breastfeeding is multi-purpose. We've got that classic activity that we all do in antenatal classes where you get parents to think about how often you eat and drink in a 24-hour period. We're also asking them how often do they express affection, how often do they communicate with another human being, because that's what breastfeeding is too. Another lesson, we're looking at constituents of breast milk. It's that classic activity where, you know, you've got the lifeboat and someone's the Prime Minister and there's a 10-year-old boy and there's an old granny. Who are you going to chuck out the lifeboat if you've got to lose one? These days it's probably the Prime Minister. You know, or the hot air balloon is this other activity as well. We're not asking them to actually get rid of one of the constituents of breast milk, but we're just asking them to value them, discuss their value, discuss their significance, understanding that water, even water has a value. And it's amazing actually how many breastfeeding parents don't appreciate water has a value in breast milk. And they think it's all about the fat content, it's all about getting to the calories, not understanding that the water is going to contain the water-soluble vitamins and does a lot of important stuff. And as well as the lesson plans, we also have these mini milk slides. And these are slides that can be used in a 10-15 minute slot. Sometimes as a teacher, a lesson is a little bit quicker than you were expecting. You might have a spare 10-15 minutes. So the idea of these slides is that they would be used as a discussion point, just beginning to bring some of these issues into people's minds. So this slide is just about the fact that breast size is about fat as well as glandular tissue. The fact that some people might have a larger breast, but that can mean more fat, not necessarily more glandular tissue. Just beginning to understand how breast structure works within our body systems and how the body prioritizes it. Another session is just talking about traveling and breastfeeding out and about and how we can support breastfeeding parents if we see them around. And another lesson is just about social media, beginning to think about representations of breastfeeding on social media. Why would this particular, if you've not come across Chrissy Teigen, have a look at her Instagram. She talks a lot about breastfeeding and positive imagery around mothering. Why did she choose to post this image on her Instagram? What did she want us to think about? What did she want us to know? She doesn't have twins, by the way. One of those is a doll that her daughters asked her to breastfeed. So if we think all breasts look like this, we're going to make some different choices about breastfeeding patterns, about how our breastfeeding works. We're also going to make some different decisions about breast surgery. We're also going to feel differently about ourselves. Now, I've talked a lot about responsive feeding. I wrote an article that talks about the dangerous obsession with the infant feeding interval that you can read on the UNICEF baby-friendly site or on my blog as well. And in this article, it's all about how breast anatomy is connected to how we have to breastfeed. Being a responsive breastfeeder is not about being a hippie. It's not about, getting in all rose petally and incensey and connecting with some hippie side. It's about human biology. If we try and impose a schedule of 3 or 4 hours, we are going to result in increased breastfeeding failure. It is dangerous. It's dangerous to maternal mental health. It's actually dangerous to babies. They are more likely to get dehydrated and take insufficient amounts of milk. And we know from the University of Western Australia and the early research using ultrasound and computerized technology, so this is the research that, I like this bit of trivia, how the mining industry in Australia was where a lot of this technology originated, because they have to analyze slag heaps of ore, and the imagery the way they did that was the same stuff that could then apply to the breast to look inside breasts. And when we started to look inside breasts, we learnt that unlike Mr. Cooper, who thought that every breast had about 20 to 25 milk ducts, that's the BBC meme lie, because that image does have about 20 to 25 milk ducts. In fact, we learnt that the range was about 4 to 18 in one particular study. Healthy lactating parent had 4 milk ducts. Another one had 18, average was about 9. That's very different from 20 to 25. We also learned that lots of the ducts are very close to the surface of the skin, so that's going to have big implications for people who are taught to breastfeed with a C-hold as standard. If everyone comes out of hospital being told to clamp their breasts, we're going to have some problems going on. We also learned, we sort of already knew this, but ultrasound really emphasized that you cannot empty breasts. We are still using that word with parents. We're still talking about draining breasts and emptying breasts. And even when we say something like draining your breast, but actually you can't completely drain your breast, that's not what parents hear. They hear the word drain breast. And then when it's 9 o'clock at night and their baby's been cluster feeding for 3 hours, they believe their breast is empty. Even if we didn't mean them to think that, even if we went drain in inverted commas and gave them a little brackets description of why that's not accurate, that's not the bit they remembered. They believe their breasts are empty, when we know it's impossible to empty your breasts more than about 76%'s worth. There's production is happening all the time. So not knowing how breasts work, not knowing about anatomy, using the wrong terms, has big implications for whether someone feels confident about breastfeeding and whether someone's happy to continue breastfeeding. And the storage capacity is really the main thing that article's about. If we believe that everyone has the same storage capacity, we will write a book where we tell everyone to get to 3 hours at 3 or 4 months. And if someone's not feeding on a 3-hourly interval, we will tell them they have to stretch their baby. So these people are reading this information, they're being told these messages by older relatives, they are desperately trying to stretch their baby, and you know what, their breasts do start to feel fuller. Wow, 2 or 3 days of doing this stretching, they are starting to feel fuller. They must be making more milk, woohoo! In fact, they're obviously getting to maximum storage capacity, they're accumulating that feedback inhibitor of lactation, that whey protein that sends signals to reduce milk supply. They're distending their prolactin receptors, we're getting less milk synthesis. So 3 or 4 days of, I can do this, I'm feeling fuller, we're likely to see supply reduction on the 4th or 5th day of that pattern. If you are the 80 milliliter parent, you may never ever get a 3-hour interval between milk feeds. If you're the 600 milliliter parent, you're much more likely to. But in the same 24-hour period, their babies will get the same amount of milk, provided the 80 millimeter parent can be kept away from the negative messaging around intervals. Breastfeeding in itself is not hard if you're told that what you're doing is normal. What is stressful is when someone tells you what you're doing is wrong, and when your baby feeds again after 40 minutes, you think something must not be working properly. And since I wrote this article, I get emails most days from mums all over the world. Philippines, Phoenix yesterday, all over the place saying thank you because I thought something was wrong. I thought something was wrong. I Googled something about breastfeeding intervals and I found your article and now I know I'm okay. Baby's fine, I was doing fine, weight gain was fine, we didn't have any breastfeeding problems. I just assumed that something was wrong with me. So responsive feeding is not optional. Responsive feeding is not a choice, it is an essential when it comes to making breastfeeding work. I will say that last week I got an email from somebody who wanted to do antenatal classes and said, would I contribute to the breastfeeding session because they'd like my perspective on how to get mums set up onto a routine at 6 weeks. Yeah, don't think they liked my reply to that one. I said, I don't think I'm the person to help you with that. Yeah, so let's see how that goes. Glandular tissue varies. I know that sounds really obvious, but you'd be surprised how often you meet a mum who says, you know what, when I'm pumping, I get significantly less from one side than I do the other. And we all go, yeah, that's normal, asymmetry's normal, don't worry, that's completely standard, we're never symmetrical, breastfeeding aren't twins, breasts aren't twins, they're sisters, they're not exactly the same. Wouldn't it be great if we didn't even have to say that? Because everybody already knew that breasts were asymmetrical. Everyone expected their glandular tissue to be asymmetrical. They expected different pumping output. Instead, we're having to correct that misassumption constantly. And if pumping output's different, why wouldn't babies behave differently? Why wouldn't one side quite often have a shorter feed? Baby's less satisfied, baby seems to have a preference. That's not always about something that needs to be fixed. That is sometimes just about anatomy. How often do we say to the mum worried about pumping output, if you're worried, you could try pumping a bit more on that side. Maybe you can increase the output on that side. If we're saying that, let's make sure we also add, but actually it could be your glandular tissue. It may always be like that. Problems don't necessarily have to be fixed. Surgery, about 92% of all cosmetic surgeries are done on people identifying as women. So this is these are the figures from BAPS for last year. That's the British Association of Aesthetic Plastic Surgeons, although BAPS is a pretty good word. 92% women, and if you have a look at the figures, you know, it's not far off. Half of all the procedures are breast related. So breast augmentation is down a little bit, breast reduction is up. We know, because we are speaking to the people who've had this surgery, that even today, people are not being given correct information about the impact of surgery on breastfeeding risk and breastfeeding success. If you're a surgeon and you've been told by your textbook that everyone's got 20 to 25 milk ducts, you're not going to blink about severing 2 or 3 milk ducts while you do some surgery. But if in fact you're told the average is 9 and 4 is not unusual, you may make some different decisions about how to perform surgery on somebody. And this is an extract from the leaflet that BAPS give people who want to consider breast reduction. This is the only reference to breastfeeding. There's something slightly messed up with the way it's set out, but it says, rarely, reduced sensation can cause problems with breastfeeding. That's the only reference to breastfeeding in this massive long leaflet. So what they're talking about there are when someone's had their nipple completely removed, sat in a dish, popped back on again. Those intercostal nerves, those 4th and 5th intercostal nerves that we need for the milk ejection reflex to work have been completely severed. Sometimes nerves can repair. If breast surgery was 10 years ago or 15 years ago, there is a chance that nerves can repair. But if someone's had breast surgery 2 or 3 years ago and they had that complete incision of the intercostal nerves, the chances of them getting a working milk ejection reflex are significantly hindered. But if they read that, they're not going to get that impression. They're going to think, oh, sensation. Oh, that's probably something about sex. I don't understand how breastfeeding works. I don't know anything about the milk ejection reflex. Neither does my surgeon. I'm sure that'll be fine. I just won't feel it when my baby breastfeeds. That's maybe what you'd think if you'd read that. It's certainly not correct information. So we need to make sure that from the very beginning, everybody, doctors, surgeons, the people who are receptionists in the surgeon's office, everybody knows how breasts grow and how breasts develop. Because if we live in a world where breasts are secret and mysterious, then breasts will be too. People will be disempowered, people will not have the right conversations, people will not ask the right questions, they will suffer in silence, and they will suffer in silence when it comes to breastfeeding. We need everybody to know, as I mentioned before, that breasts develop in utero, that as a species, breast development is prioritised. We need to know that breast buds usually start to develop around 8 years of age in this country. So what's the point of sex education happening at the end of year 6 when SATs are out the way? Let's squash all the breast education into May and June and July when we finished our SATs. Way too late. Some of those guys will have had their breasts for 2 or 3 years prior to that sex education lesson. The menstrual period is very likely to start about 18 months after the development of first breast buds. So we're seeing periods starting 9, 10, very typical, 11, not unusual. The average age of the onset of menstruation has decreased generation by generation. So if we started when we were 12, our daughters probably will start when they're 10, 11. That would not be unusual. So how can we be delaying these conversations? Oh, it'll happen in secondary school. We'll talk about it in secondary school. Way too late. If you have your first breast bud at 8 and 9, you're going to be very scared if you have not a clue what you were experiencing. Lots of young people don't realise that asymmetry isn't just normal, it is the norm. More than 50% of adolescents develop asymmetrically when breast development happens. Lots of young people don't realise how breasts grow. So it's very normal when breasts begin to develop to have that a mound and then a secondary mound on top. Looks a bit like a haystack on top of a hill. So the areola bulges away from the main breast. We get an additional mound that's areola and nipple. And if you're a young person, that's going to freak you out because that's not what nipples and breasts look like on the ones you've seen. The ones you're familiar with, only the nipple is proud of the breast. So what the heck is this doing? In fact, that areola mound is going to sink back into the main body of the breast and the nipple will usually just be prominent at the end. And the menstrual cycle is about breast development. So the first half of the menstrual cycle, you've got estrogen, which is going to be stimulating milk duct development. In the second half of the menstrual cycle, we've got progesterone coming along, which is going to be stimulating the milk-making cell development. It's not just your uterus getting ready for babies, your breasts are getting ready for babies too. So even in adulthood, we're still going to get those estrogen, progesterone surges. We're still going to get breast fullness towards the onset of our bleeding because that's the body getting ready for lactation. If we give those messages, we are telling people that breasts are important, that our bodies are expecting to breastfeed. What are these? I'm going to guess not many people in this room own these, but some people might, depending on what you do. So this is a picture from the John Lewis website. These are nipple covers, because of course nipples are meant to be invisible. And this woman is on the John Lewis website selling bras. Some people do not have nipples because they're post-mastectomy and their nipples may not be on their bodies anymore. I don't think this is the case for this woman because all her friends seem to be missing nipples as well. Because when you're selling transparent bras, you will Photoshop off a nipple if you were a manufacturer. All over the place. Big retailers, invisible nipples. And of course, when you look at the bra selection, we've got that lovely phrase T-shirt bra. T-shirt bra means we'll be hiding your nipples, don't worry. Bras are smooth and seamless. They're made of thick foam. We're constantly giving this message that breasts are about the gaze of others. And it's our duty to make sure that we don't provoke other people through irresponsible clothing decisions. So we get little girls being told to wear vests from a very early age. We've got people being told to wear bras and vests. That was one of the people I interviewed for the breast book. Her mum made her wear a vest over her first bra, even though she was in Dubai and sweating like anything. And we're also being told lots of contradictory messages around breasts. So why is it that if you're at the Royal Variety performance and you're meeting the Queen, you might wear a skimpy top that shows your breasts, but the next day if you go for a job interview, if you showed the same amount of breast tissue, they would probably escort you out the building? Why is it we have different rules about when it's okay to show breasts? If you're a young person, how on earth will you get that information? You will just learn it from the sniggering of others. So if a larger woman with larger breasts gets on the bus, she's not wearing a bra, she's wearing a tight T-shirt, people will react to that because as a culture we don't expect people to do that. We expect them to wear a firm, large bra. We don't expect breasts to move. Where is all that stuff coming from? Young people are picking up all this messaging and no one is talking to them about it. No one is helping them unpick it. And we've got a bit of a crisis when it then comes 10 years later to asking these people to breastfeed. One thing that I've come across a little bit in the last few months is the idea that if only we could stop breasts being sexual, all our problems would go away. In January, I was on Woman's Hour talking about my book, and Philippa Perry, who's the wife of Grace and Perry, phoned up, because she's who she is, she gets straight through, and her message gets straight through. Oh, if only breasts weren't about sex, everything would be so much easier. Well, we don't have a little flashy stick from Men in Black. Breasts are about sex for the vast majority of people in our culture. You do not have to be a breastfeeding supporter and sign up to Breasts Aren't About Sex. They are. And newsflash, they're also about sex for people who are actually breastfeeding at the same time. When I did my first survey on sex and breastfeeding, huge minority of women who were feeling absolutely awful about the fact that their breasts were still sexual for them. It's much more acceptable to say publicly, oh, I don't like people touching my breasts, I want to wear a bra during sex. Everyone goes, yeah, me too. They're off limits at the moment. He knows he'll get them back eventually, but they're off limits. It's really unacceptable to go, actually, my nipples have become much more sensitive, and I love using my breasts during sex, now I'm breastfeeding. You do not see that on Facebook. Those conversations are not allowed because we're asking people to compartmentalize their bodies, compartmentalize their breasts. Large breasts are also not catered for. This is a shop. This is actually the Gap in London. Every single bra was C cup or smaller, even though the average size of breasts in the UK is 36 double D. Go into Victoria's Secret, E cup is as big as it gets. You might get some double Ds, they don't sell above E cup. So larger breasted women, who are more than half the population, are being told they're abnormal. They're not seeing themselves represented in breastfeeding literature. And sagginess. We all know that breastfeeding doesn't cause sagginess. We know that sagginess is about the menopause and the loss of estrogen, meaning that the connective tissue gets dehydrated and we're likely to lose some of that elasticity. It's about weight gain and weight loss. It's about smoking. It's also about pregnancy. For some young people, sagginess is their natural default breast shape. It does not mean that something has gone wrong. So if you've not already come across this woman, this is Chidida Egaru. If you've not read her work, I would urge you to go and find her. Saggy Boobs Matter, hashtag Saggy Boobs Matter, and her book, What a Time to Be Alone. She is talking about being a young woman with saggy breasts, going around a department store trying to buy a bra, every single bra telling her there was something wrong with her body. And as breastfeeding supporters, we've got to remember that nipples don't always point in the same direction. Many of us are talking about the angle of the dangle. But we're still finding people talking about tummy to mummy. And actually, if your nipples point down, tummy to mummy is going to mean a baby with a twisted head doing all sorts of uncomfortable things. There will be some babies whose tummies look up at the sky because that is the angle needed to breastfeed correctly. You've got to be really careful, especially if you're giving phone support, with making assumptions about the shape of a woman's body. Breastfeeding pillows are not going to work for a lot of people. Many women will not be able to see the baby latching because of the angle of their nipples, so we're going to have to talk about other things. We're going to have to talk about sensation. We're going to have to talk about the bits they can see. What we shouldn't be doing is asking them to pull their breast into a shape that fits what we think breastfeeding should look like. And we're still finding that that's the message that some women are being given. How many of us have worked with a woman who apologizes for her breasts? Who takes off a bra and goes, oh, I'm sorry, I know I'm a bit of a mess. I don't normally look like this. Everything's just a bit wobbly and saggy at the moment. If you believe your body's deficient on the outside, you're going to feel it's deficient on the inside as well. So we're trying to correct that with some of the imagery that we're producing from the ABM. So we had our Feed On campaign this year, showing lots of different kinds of women breastfeeding in lots of different ways. A couple of final things, about 3 minutes left. Variation is normal. We're not just talking about asymmetry, we're not just talking about breast size and the number of milk ducts and the numbers of duct openings and pumping capacity. We've got to make sure we're talking about accessory breast tissue. About 6% of the population have accessory breast tissue. That's 1 in 18 people. We're going to meet women who have it and people who have it when we support them. For many people, it may be that their extra nipple, so polythelia is an extra nipple, is probably down there somewhere. They may not realise they ever had it until it starts to drip milk during lactation. They may just notice baby's getting really wet. Someone tells them, oh, check that cheek's nice and close. Maybe the milk's leaking out. No, they had an extra nipple. Most people who have accessory breast tissue will not have polymastia, which is a completely extra breast with an areola and a nipple. They're most likely to have a bit of a bulge in their armpit. They may notice some sensitivity during their menstrual cycle, but actually postpartum engorgement is when it's going to really hit them hard. They will have a firm area in their armpit that's not going anywhere. That is terrifying if everything you read online tells you you're going to be getting mastitis very soon. You have a blocked duct. It's your job to get rid of that blockage. You've got people manically trying to massage accessory tissue that's not connected to anything else. And in fact, they just needed cold compresses, a bit of time, and that would resolve. We've got to have accessory breast tissue in the back of our mind when we support parents, because we're going to come across it. This might sound stupidly obvious, but unfortunately, this is something that we have to flag up. Breasts come in different colours. And if we don't get that, in when we produce breastfeeding materials, if we don't get that in conversations we have with families, we are contributing to this problem when black mothers are much more likely to die in childbirth and in 6 weeks postpartum, because it's all part of the same conversation. When women are made to feel other, they are not made to feel that they are part of a community, they are disempowered with the language that we're using. So this white block here, this is actually from the NHS website. The first thing it says for symptoms of mastitis is a red area on your breast. If you've got a very dark skin tone, you may not see any redness on your breast with mastitis at all. So when we're on the helpline, we've got to be really careful. We don't ever make an assumption about the colour of somebody's skin. We need to make sure we ask questions. Thrush is another big one. So people aren't going to die if they don't get thrush treatment, but they are likely to struggle. They may end breastfeeding early. They may feel sad and alienated. How many people talk about thrush symptoms as a pinker nipple or a redder nipple than usual? That's no good to someone whose nipple has never been pink or never been red. So we might see hypopigmentation, and this photograph is courtesy of Catherine Watson-Jenner. Loss of pigment on the nipple is one of the symptoms that we'll see if you're a woman who has a darker skin tone. Okay, so we've got to talk to young people, and we might think as breastfeeding counsellors and breastfeeding specialists we're kind of immune from this conversation, because our children, if we are parents, see breastfeeding all the time. They hear us on the phone to people, they see our knitted breasts. But actually, we may have to work even harder, because it may be harder for us to empathise with a young person who is scared of breasts, who is scared of being sexy, who's frightened of developing breasts, who doesn't feel they can say that to you because you're just going to go, come on, it's all about breastfeeding. Isn't it wonderful you've got breasts because one day you're going to be a parent? They are terrified. They need someone who can listen to those worries. They may not like having breasts. They may not trust them. They need to be able to express those feelings. We need to continue to embrace the fact they're sexual as well. We need to push schools to have these conversations, because it's not going to happen automatically. We need to make sure that we always keep breast anatomy in mind when we're thinking about breastfeeding patterns and responsive feeding. We need to expect variation, not just in colour of skin, but think about accessory breast tissue. Expect asymmetry when you're supporting parents. And when it comes to messages and breastfeeding resources, making sure that we're valuing diversity, both in terms of ethnic diversity, but also in terms of trans parents and parents that may not feel included in the language that we're using. And this is an image that was on my website, and I'm flickering on. Just something you can use with young people to have conversations around breastfeeding, just starting some of those early conversations. It's never too young to start talking about breast development and breastfeeding. If we're embarrassed about having conversations around breast development, that's our culture's fault. And it's, as I said, it's not something that should be happening in the last few months of year 6. It's got to happen all the time. That's me. There you go. If anyone's got any questions. Now, I'm aware that I don't want to run into break time, so I will be around if anyone's got any questions. I'll be around downstairs if anyone wants to ask me anything.
Yeah, and we'll be at the printer and marking stand in the middle of the atrium, and she can sign copies of her book if you'd like to get one for the girls in her life. Thank you very much, Emma. That was such an amazing start to the festival, and thank you all for being here. So we've got a 15-minute break now before Maggie's talk at 11 o'clock. So grab a coffee. You're welcome to stay here if you want to do, but come and grab a coffee as soon as I say. Is there like a
don't want to touch anything and then ruin
I'm
it.
just wondering, can you, because there's that echo with the sound.
Well, the trouble is if you don't have the mic on, you
We're
won't.
just wondering, can we turn the mic down a bit and then turn the volume up downstairs? Would that work?
Yeah, that might
Yeah.
work.
And then you'll
Yeah,
still
yeah.
get the speaking through, won't you?
How do we turn the volume down on the mic?
Right, I'll show you.
Okay.